Americans tend to have this Amerocentric view of the world and of ourselves and think that we are the greatest democracy in the world and we know how to do everything and we invented this stuff, everybody should follow us and we got to figure it out. Maybe not. On the line with us is Ali Velshi, the host of MSNBC's Velshi on weekend mornings. You can tweet him at Ali Velshi, ALIVELSHI, or the VX, or MSNBC. And Ali, welcome back to the program.
Tom, good to be with you. Thank you for having me back.
My pleasure. You grew up in Canada, and in fact, I've seen the promos on MSNBC about your dad running for political office. And you've traveled around the world. You've visited a lot of advanced democracies, as have I. What is your sense of what the lessons that we can learn from other democracies should be?
Well, I think the blockages on the American side are twofold, right? This concept of American exceptionalism and this idea that we invented a bunch of things that other people should absorb. And not all of that is wrong. America has come up with some really interesting things that others should absorb. But there are glaring examples, many of them fall into education and mainly in healthcare, for instance, where pretty much every other established country in the world, every other prosperous country in the world has figured out, hey, there's this way in which you can provide everybody with healthcare. And there are many different systems. I come from Canada where it was single payer healthcare, but that's not the only way you can do this. But this universality, everybody gets healthcare. Guess what? It's cheaper per capita. The entire cost is lower for everyone. The outcomes are better. Generally speaking, people are healthier. And I thought when we were having the Obamacare discussion, that people would have reached out and said, here's a way in which we can take what Denmark does and what Canada does well and what these other countries do well and combine them in a way that works for us in America. But the problem is this rejection of the idea that someone else's plan or success might work prevents Americans from adopting the best of it, right? If Americans were smart about this, we'd say, we can pick the best of it. There's this array of things when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to early childhood education, when it comes to maternal mortality, when it comes to abortion, that we can pick and choose and make our own version of. But there's a resistance to doing it. So when it comes to healthcare, America, for instance, remains a place where our costs are 2 to 3 times that of anywhere else in the industrialized world, with a greater percentage of people not covered and a higher cost. You just have to look to Canada to say, there's a way of doing this. And I'll tell you, Tom, as a Canadian, and you've probably met a lot of people like me who will tell you everything Canada does is right and better. That's not true. It's not true that universal health care or single-payer health care is exactly the best system. It's not true that there's nothing wrong with the system. What is true is that we have developed a consensus in a place like Canada and many other countries in which health care is a right. And so the government involves itself in the provision of it in many different ways. We talk in America about how it's communist, it's government controlled. That's just not true. The government's just the payer of healthcare. It negotiates good rates. And whether you are conservative or a liberal in a place like Canada or France or Germany or Norway or Denmark, this is not a thing you debate. Conservatives think that universal health care is good because it gets you better outcomes at a lower price. Liberals think universal health care is good because it's a thing that should be a right, and people end up being healthier and more productive. Bottom line is that's just one example of the way in which America, if it just would open its mind a little bit, would be able to say, we can pick the best of what everybody else has and make it our own.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we did this show for a week from the studios of Danish radio in Copenhagen. And I was interviewing pretty much exclusively conservatives because I love to debate conservatives on this program. And I had on, one of the leaders of the conservative movement in the Danish parliament. And I said, so you're a conservative? He's like, yeah. And I said, so that means that you want to get rid of your national health care program? And he looked at me like really funny.
Yeah.
He said, are you crazy? Those were the first words out of his mouth. And I said, well, you want to do away with, free college education? He says, well, are you nuts? And I said, well, what makes you a conservative? And he says, we don't want immigrants. And suddenly the penny dropped, right?
Also a problem, and that's one of the reasons why we can't look at every other country and say, oh, they've got it all figured out. But in this particular, in some of these instances, education, healthcare, prisons, and things like that, the things that they call communist or socialist or liberal in America are conservative views in many other developed countries.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I lived in Germany for a year, and back in the 80s, a little over a year, and was not involved in the politics of the day, although I was interacting with some politicians, the stuff that I was doing. And they have pretty strong anti-corruption laws. We did here in the United States after the Nixon bribery scandals and all those sort of things. But in '76 with the Buckley decision, in '78 with the Bellotti decision that was authored by Lewis Powell, those two decisions, Buckley said that if billionaires want to pour money down the throats of politicians, that's no longer considered bribery or corruption. That's considered free speech. And then in '78, the Bellotti decision said, oh, and if corporations want to do that, that's fine too. Now, they both had limitations and respected some of the legislation that had been passed in the '70s. That all got blown to hell in 2010 with Citizens United. So now it seems to me, and I'm not enough of a scholar of all the other democracies in the world, and I'm not sure that you are either, but maybe you're informed about this. It seems to me like we're pretty much the only advanced democracy in the world where political bribery has actually been fully legalized. And as a consequence, we have had at least 20 years of gridlock. I can't think of a single piece of legislation that's passed in the last 20 years whose principal beneficiaries are not either rich people or big corporations, including Obamacare.
Yeah, we are a standout amongst OECD countries on a lot of levels with respect to some of it's campaign financing, but some of it is just the types of rules that prevent that kind of money from influencing the process in terms of the type of advertising you can do, the length of the amount you can spend per voter, the campaign period. So there are lots of improvements that we can make on that front. The two in the U.S., the 2.5 that are the most concerning that we should remedy is that what people haven't figured out, what a lot of voters haven't figured out, is that while it's sort of a legalized corruption, the way major corporations and other organizations can influence the political process, the lack of transparency as to how they do it is remarkable. The groups that corporate America belong to that write legislation for states. It's why these restrictive legislations about voting or voting rights or privatization of prisons all look the same, because it's sometimes the companies we all work for that are writing that legislation through these opaque groups that don't identify themselves very clearly. So the clarity, the transparency is not there. If you had transparency, you'd realize the influence of the money, at which point you'd probably feel compelled to say this should be a major issue. But for so many Americans, it feels extraneous. It doesn't feel like the thing that's actually the most threatening to democracy, but it is. And the converse of that, Tom, is when you see things like transgender restrictions or voting restrictions, what you are seeing in some states, not everywhere and not universally, is major corporations who are saying, we're going to withhold donations. We're going to hold back on people who support this. Now, it's not gone far enough, and it should have gone a lot farther than it did. But that's when you start to realize that we do actually have to have, if companies and corporations have the kind of influence they have in politics, then we need to put financial pressure on them to make some of those decisions, because we're not fixing our electoral finance system just yet.
Yeah, although there was a pretty good shot at that with H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that got blown up by every Republican in the Senate and Sinema and Manchin.
But part of it is because people don't feel the urgency of it, right? Yeah. It's the same thing with voting rights. If I'm in Manhattan, I have waited a little bit of time in line, but it's not onerous and it's not hot, and I can do that. So this doesn't feel existential to me. It doesn't really feel like our voting rights are being taken away. But it's not just the difficulty in getting to a polling booth, which is very real in places like Georgia and Texas in the South, but it is this. Right? It's the influence that people have on what you see, what you read, and how things are done.